Welcome back to Sika Strength. Welcome back to Sika Stan. Today we're going to talk about how to program as you're trying to make big technical changes to your squat. So at Sika Strength, you'll have seen a lot of videos on technical analysis of the squat, the deadlift, the press, the clean, the snatch. And we'll always talk about the ideal technical models. We'll talk about the cueing and technical focus of those lifts and how you might want to change your own particular technique to become more efficient, more powerful, to become stronger more easily. But a question we very commonly get is, what should my programming look like during this time? What should I be doing to change these technical aspects of my lift? And what should the relative timelines for those changes be? So today, let's take a look at that with a specific focus on the squat. So there's a number of ways we make technical changes for a barbell movement. So the first way we have is just technical cueing. This is the equivalent of maybe your coach giving you a cue to keep your chest up, maybe brace harder, keep your knees tracking over your toes. Whatever it is, it's a cue. You make a change then on behalf of that input they've given you. And then because of that cue, you've made an active change towards better technique. Now, there are multiple forms of cueing, be that verbal cueing, visual cueing, kinesthetic cueing. They all have slightly different impacts, but for the sake of this video and for the sake of what your programming will look like when you're making those technical changes, we'll just put that in the technical change or cued technical change pile. The second mode of changing our technique is bringing up one of our deficits. And this particular one is a strength deficit or a speed or power deficit. So say during the squat, we're getting ourselves falling forward as we're standing up out of the hole. Maybe we've done some analysis of that and we see that our knees are shooting back. We're putting all the bias onto our posterior chain. And because of those knees shooting back, those hips being loaded up, our torso is falling forward. Now, in this case, it's very simple. Our legs are too weak, so we've subconsciously or automatically shifted the focus onto our posterior chain. And now in this case, no matter how much technical cueing I give you, no matter how loud my verbal cues are, no matter how clear my visual cues are, or no matter how in your face we are with a kinesthetic cue such as an elastic band or a box underneath you, you're not going to be able to make that technical change, or you won't have a lasting technical change because you have a deficit in the actual system you're using. So your strength levels are too low or your power levels are too low to be able to make that technical change long term. Now, the final mode of failure we tend to see is a failure of range of motion. So due to some muscular tightness or some joint restriction, we cannot maintain those good positions, or we can't hit those good positions in the first place because of a lack of range of motion. So in the first case, we used cues and coaching input to fix our deficits. In the second case, we used some programming and strength work to bring up those deficits. Now in the final case, we'll be using some soft tissue work, some stretching, maybe some voodoo flossing, whatever it is. We're going to gain range of motion and therefore increase our technical prowess and move us further or closer to the ideal technical model. In each of these cases, we'll have a slightly different alteration of programming. In the first case, where I'm using a technical cue to allow myself to hit those positions or to give myself a small amount of stimulus in the right place, then the change to programming is very, very simple. So the first thing I need to do is I need to make sure that my volume or intensity never reaches a point where I cannot use that stimulus effectively. So if it's 300 kilos on my back and my back squat is 230 kilos, it does not matter how much you shout at me to keep my chest up, I'm simply not going to be able to do it. Now, in the same case, if I was to do heavy sets of 10 for say 5 sets of 10 at 60% of 1RM, that amount of volume will induce so much fatigue that any amount of those physical or visual or verbal cues simply won't work. My system won't be able to do it. And so in this case, when we're using a coaching cue to fix our technique, the alteration we make with our programming is usually a noted step down in both volume and intensity. Now, a very common programming schema we have here is moving between moderate reps, moderate sets, and moderate load. So a very standard case for this is starting off with 3 sets of 3 at around 65 to 75% of 1RM. Most of you watching this video will know that those reps, sets, and weight you're doing them at are very, very achievable and very repeatable. Now, we don't just stick at 3x3. Usually what we'll do is we'll slowly build up volume, then we'll build up intensity. So in this case, we'll go from 3 sets of 3 to 5 sets of 3. Now, we'll probably keep that weight the same, going from session 1 to session 2. Session 2 is probably going to be around 2 or 3 days later down the line. What happens once you've done 5 sets of 3? Then we'll probably go to 3 sets of 5. Then we'll probably go to 5 sets of 5. We've now gone from 3 sets of 5 to 5x5 at around 65%. Once we've hit that point, what we're probably going to do is have a small increase in intensity, make sure we're still focusing on all those ideal technical frameworks, make sure our technique looks like what we want it to look like. And now we're going to go from that 5x5 at 65% to back to 3x3 at 70%. And we go 3x3, 5x3, 3x5, 5x5. Once we do the 5x5, maybe another 5% increase. And you'll see in this way, we're still making progress. But the most important aspect is that we're really concentrating on those coaching cues, and that during this time, we're not just treading water. So a lot of the time we'll hear powerlifters, we'll hear athletes, we'll hear weightlifters talking about, I'm just going in for a technique session. I'm just really focusing on my technique. I really want to dial that in. And that focus is great. That intent is great, but it's very important we don't just tread water with that programming progression. You'll see in the case I've outlined here, we're still making clear progress. Now, there's 2 things about this progress. The first thing is we start very, very low. So 3x3 at 65% is incredibly easy to do. And then the second part of that is that the rate of progression is very slow. So I'm not going to be suddenly making those great technical changes, session 1, session 2, session 3, then suddenly have this big increase in load and not be able to hold on to those technical changes. In this case, we'll be able to continuously build slowly and steadily through those rates of progression or through those schemes of progression. And then we'll be able to hold on to those technical changes that we've used our cues to make. Now, in the second case, where we have a clear strength deficit that causes some sort of non-ideal technical position. So let's take, for example, we get somebody and their lower back is rounding at the bottom of the squat. So maybe their legs are very, very strong, but they're just not able to maintain that position as they stand up out of the hole. Now, there's obviously some technical cues we could be using here. We could be forcing the person to focus more on that midline bracing. We could be adjusting the height that they're squatting to make sure that they never get that posterior pelvic tilt at the bottom of the squat. But in many cases, it's the midline is just a bit too weak here. Now, another time we'll see this is when we get somebody's knees caving in. Their hips aren't strong enough to hold those knees out. They go into valgus knee rotation where they get their adductors kicking in at the same time. And in both of those cases, a small amount of strength work for a number of weeks will make a massive difference. Now, at this time, it's very important we properly address the programming around our squat. So if we're doing our back squat, usually we would be back squatting twice a week in ideal circumstances. Now, in this case, we won't be doing back squats twice a week with the standard rate of progression. But what we're probably going to do is we'll take some of that training capital. So if we imagine we have this certain amount of training we're able to do, now we'll take some of that and put it into our specific accessory work, whether that's specific lower back work, whether that's midline stability work, whether that's specific quad hypertrophy work, whatever it is, we'll take some of those sets and reps and that metaphorical training capital and we'll put it into that specific accessory piece. Now, in this case, if I was to do 5 sets of 8 on the squat this week, and now I know I'm going to be taking that away from the squat, well, that's probably going to look like 3 sets of 6 or 4 sets of 6. The other thing we can do with those squats is we can de-incentivize those squats, so we can take some of the intensity out of those. So maybe it was supposed to be 5 sets of 8 at 70% of your 1RM. Now I'm going to be doing 4 sets of 6 and maybe it's only 65% of my 1RM. We'll talk about timelines in a second, but it's important to note that this stepwise decreasing in total amount of squatting is only for a short period. It's to allow me to do that specific hypertrophy work and strength work. It's allow me to recover from those sessions and then bring all of that gained experience and gained strength back into my squat work in a very short period of time, and then probably just have to go into a maintenance phase or holding pattern with those specific accessory pieces. In many ways, for this kind of training, we're just facilitating you doing more of those accessories. We're facilitating the gain in strength in the abductors, in the lower back, in the erector spinae, whatever it is, wherever we're trying to gain that very specific strength to get rid of that imbalance or get rid of that massive deficit. We're just facilitating that by taking some of the other training load out. Now, that other training load doesn't necessarily just have to come out of the squat. If we're also deadlifting heavy or pressing heavy or doing a lot of other heavy training sessions throughout the week, it might be useful to just say, okay, in the next period of training, I'm going to de-incentivize those slightly. I'm going to have a prep phase, for want of a better term. And then in that prep phase, I'll really address those specific strength deficits and make sure then that my squat can be achieved with that technical framework that I really want to be doing. Now, the final case here is that you need to achieve some extra range of motion, whether that be in your ankles, your quads, your hips, your shoulders, wherever it is. The squat, and particularly the high bar ass to grass squat, demands a lot of our flexibility and our mobility. So our ability to control ourselves through a certain range of motion is absolutely vital. Now, the most common place we see this for powerlifters is if they're going for that full ass to grass high bar style squat and they might have been low bar squatting for a number of years. In this case, we'll usually have to look at their ankles and we'll usually have to look at their hips. So when we look at the ankles, it's very, very simple. They just don't have that much flexion in the ankle joint. If they were to put their toes 5 inches out from the wall and push their knees forward over their toes, do a 1/2 inch kneeling wall test, they'll have that restricted range of motion there. And what this forces us to do as you sit towards the bottom of the squat is keep your hips back further. Obviously, the further the hips go back, the more the torso inclines forward. So in this case, when we're looking at changing our training program or changing our programming, generally speaking, to gain extra range of motion, what we're really looking at here is a time commitment. So most of us don't have the time to spend all day in the gym. If you did, that would be absolutely great. But when we're looking at changing the range of motion and alteration of the training program, time commitment is the thing. Realistically, 20 to 30 minutes every day is a standard amount of time for a semi-serious amateur lifter to be spending on their mobility work when they're making big changes. Now, the other thing here that can really help is some professional help, whether that's a physical therapist or a sports massage therapist, to work your way through those fibers, to really break up those fibers and just get that extra suppleness into those tissues. The other thing to consider here is that when we're doing all of this additional range of motion work, this additional myofascial release work, this stretching, these loaded stretches, band distracted stretches, all of these things take something from us, and what they're taking is a small amount of muscle tendon unit integrity. So imagine as we're exercising, we get those micro tears in the muscle. As we're doing long hold static stretches, as we're doing very aggressive myofascial release work, as we're getting physical therapy, many of those micro tears might actually be elongated, or the length of time they'll stay in the tissue before recovering might be elongated. So when we're doing that range of motion work, we want to be conscious of that. If I'm doing a lot of ballistic plyometric work, if I'm doing a lot of very explosive squats out of the hole, I probably shouldn't be doing a massive amount of heavy barbell work on my calves and Achilles tendon directly before that. So in that case, we do a simple thing. We move those sessions slightly further apart. Maybe I do my mobility work in the morning. Maybe I do all my strength training or weightlifting in the evening. Now, this doesn't work for everyone. For most of us, we'll just have one period of the day where we really can devote an hour or 2 hours to our training. And so in that case, what you're probably going to want to do is do your stretching or your general range of motion work following the training session. We get two things from that. So the first thing is that the muscles are already warmed up. They're already in a position where they are quite supple. And now I'm probably going to be able to stretch a little bit further on my stretches. And I'm probably going to be able to go a little bit harder on that foam roller or barbell I'm using for my self-massage. Now, the second aspect of doing it after your training session is we won't get any of those perceived decrements that might come from those long hold static stretches in our actual session themselves. Now, today's video isn't talking about the decrement that might come along with static stretching and power production. That's a conversation for another day, but just a quick brief note on it. Don't be overly worried by it. It really won't affect you all that much. But for want of a better term, put it afterwards. You'll get a bit more out of the stretching. Your muscle will feel a little bit better when you're doing it. And it will also help to just keep that blood flowing through the muscle a little bit longer. Hopefully help with those perceived pains or that DOMS you'll get the next day. So the next thing is, how long is all of this going to take? So obviously we're talking about three very different methods of improving your technique here. We're talking about using technical cues, we're talking about using specific strength interventions, and we're talking about altering your range of motion. It's obvious that all of these three things are going to take very, very different amounts of time. Now, in terms of technical cues, you're probably going to be holding on for a technical cue for a lot longer than you think you will be. What we should see, though, when we're using cues effectively and when we're using technical feedback effectively, is we should get an almost immediate response to that cue. Now, if we don't get a response to that cue and we feel like we're really giving it everything we possibly can, we need to alter the type of cueing where needed. Maybe we need to go from a slightly less extrinsic third-person view of that verbal cue as I'm talking about it, and maybe I need to give that person a more direct cue for what it feels like for them. So let's take an example of somebody's heels raising off the ground as they're sitting down into a squat. My first verbal cue might be to make them aware of it. So as a coach or as a training partner, I'll say, your heels are rising off the ground. Make sure we keep those heels down. Now they do 2 more sets and we still see the same error even though I'm repeating the same cue. It's not necessarily that the cue doesn't work here. I just need to give them a slightly different cue, and that might just be giving them an idea of how that will feel for them in their body. So I'll say, keep the weight back on your heels. Keep the weight back on your heels as they sit down. And in that case, if I see a better uptake, I know I'm going to need to give that style of cue more often. In this case, what I'm talking about here is the immediate response to that cue means something. It's not necessarily that we keep shouting it at somebody. So obviously, we've heard people like Aaron Kroll talking on the channel about a coach giving the same cue for the 6 months of a training block. That's absolutely perfect. But we need to make sure that coaching cue is being used effectively and is being effectively heard by the athlete. It's actually doing something. So in terms of timelines here, probably kind of 2 to 4 weeks. Let's say 4 to 8 sessions where we're using that coaching cue. We should be seeing differences in their technique afterwards. Now, in terms of the strength intervention, obviously that strength intervention is going to take a little bit longer. Ideally, you're coming at it from someone who has a big deficit and there's a massive glut of low-hanging fruit there. In that case, you're probably going to see those increases in strength coming up very, very quickly. In most cases, we'll say around 8 to 12 weeks of specific strength intervention should have a noticeable change on someone's technique afterwards. Now, will that mean after my 2 or 3 months of belt squats that I'm going to have a fully upright ass to grass squat forever? Absolutely not. If we have the strength deficit, it's probably there for a reason. It might be there due to a specific morphology or specific pattern of training we've done in the past. In that case, we'll probably have to stay on it in perpetuity as long as we want to keep squatting like that, but we probably won't have to give it the same emphasis or the same amount of training capital. But generally speaking, 4 to 8 weeks, 2 to 3 months of a specific strength intervention will make a massive difference. Now, finally, on the range of motion stuff, and this is absolutely vital, range of motion takes a while to change, right? If I'm looking for changes in ankle mobility, I take 10,000 steps a day. That's each ankle and calf unit doing 5,000 calf raises a day at 100 kilos, right? We're not going to just do a 15-second hold on our ankles and suddenly see a massive difference. But the real important thing here is we are testing, stretching, and retesting again almost every session, and definitely, if not every session, every week, and making sure that that mobility work we're working so hard on every day is making a big difference. So the mobility work, we should have a near instant view on if it's making a difference or not. Will that transfer immediately into the squat mechanics? Maybe not. Maybe that will take another couple of weeks or a couple of sessions of practice for it to transfer effectively over. But when we're doing stretches or we're doing myofascial release or whatever it is we're doing to increase that range of motion, I should be able to go to the wall, do a 1/2 inch kneeling wall test, do my ankle mobility for 10 or 15 minutes and come back and see a noticeable difference there. That is absolutely vital. That's why we see a massive amount of people falling out of favor with their mobility work, because they just don't notice a difference because they're not testing and retesting every session. I really hope this video was valuable for you. If you have more questions like this, please drop them in the comments down below. We always love to hear it. This video is brought to you by the imminent launch of the Sika Strength t-shirts. When you're watching this, if you're on the app, you'll definitely have access to those t-shirts already, or on the newsletter that you can gain access to on the website. So there's 3 t-shirts. You can also buy a 3-pack bundle for a nice discount. And as I said earlier, if you have questions, pop them down in the comments below.